There are a couple of NGOs who are based in Sheffield but are beginning to provide services to Hull now. And one's called Ashiana. Again, Stephen Clay will give you their contact details. And one's called the Snowdrop Project. The thing about both these projects is they are providing services to people who have been rescued from trafficking situations, have had their claim as a trafficking victim accepted as valid. You have this thing called the 45-day reflection period when you're supposed to liaise with the police and tell them everything you know while they're waiting for a formal decision to accept the claim. The problem has been, remains at the moment, that once your claim is accepted, you're more or less left to get on with your life. Well, for people, who've been deeply traumatised, don't know their way around the system, they're not British, they may not speak English very well, they may have been in a brothel, being raped 10 times a night for possibly years. You need help with housing, you need help with benefits, you need help with rebuilding your life, with finding a job, and so on. And that's the sort of thing these two projects are doing. They're providing support for people. Now, if you think the procurement budgets of something like the NHS are absolutely vast, they're much bigger than even, Tesco or Sainsbury's or Asda or whatever. So it kind of makes a lot of logical sense. There's no reason why not. So Hull City Council, for example, will have, I don't know what its procurement budget is, but it's probably more than £36 million a year, which is the current threshold for companies having to provide a modern slavery statement. So what you could do is identify half a dozen big companies. Now the way to do it, I suppose, would be to go on their website, look at their annual report, see what their turnover is. If it's more than £36 million, they have to have, by now, because it's a year after that particular bit of the Act came into force, they have to have an anti-slavery statement on their website. So you might look at Tesco's, you might look at Debenhams, I don't know, who's in town here. Primark, I know Primark are a bloody great place down on the quayside, haven't they? H&M. Don't know John Lewis is here, do we? No, Asda, Sainsbury, all the big food supermarkets. Find the ones that have got a turnover of more than £36 million, and then look on their website, look at their annual report and see if they have an anti-slavery statement and see how good it is, because a lot of the anti-slavery statements that have been posted, and bear in mind we're talking about thousands of companies that ought to be covered by the provision, probably only hundreds have actually done anything about it, and a lot of them seem to be using some kind of template provided by consultants. It seems like this is big business now. There are consultants running around the country saying, I can give you, £4,000, I can give you an anti-slavery statement. All you do is kind of insert your own brand name. But actually what they seem to be are statements which are about aspirations rather than about what they're doing. So if you can pick out statements which sound like they're actually doing something, for example, are they engaging with their main suppliers about the conditions under which the stuff that they supply is being produced? Can they tell you what the supply chain looks like? For somebody like Tesco, they will have an organisation, probably their own organisation, which is supplying wholesale to them. Of course, they've just brought up Booker's too, so a lot of the wholesale stuff will be done through Booker's. But if you think about a lettuce grown in Lincolnshire, say, we don't have to go to Bangladesh to find supply chains, they're here in the UK. If you think about who produces the lettuce seed, who plants it, who grows it, who harvests it, who cleans it, who packages it, who transports, the supply chain may be 8 or 9 links long before that washed, cleaned, cut lettuce arrives on the shelf in Sainsbury or Tesco or wherever it happens to be. So, you know, how far back does Tesco or wherever it is go down their supply chain? A lot of them will say, we get an undertaking from our wholesaler that they're slavery free. But does the wholesaler get an undertaking from the people who supply them? And so on. And there are some foodstuffs, and food industry is notorious now because it runs what's called a just-in-time model, which is essentially Tesco telling their suppliers, we want 100 boxes of lettuces tomorrow or whatever, you know, very short time scale. Maybe there's a bank holiday coming up and they realise they're going to need a lot more. The problem with that is that, you know, one supplier might end up saying, well, I can give you 50 boxes, that's all I can manage, but I know somebody who can get the other 50. And that person who might be able to get the other 50 might say, well, I can do 20, but I know somebody who can do the other 30. Before you know where you are, you're in a land of flexibility and unknowingness. People are producing stuff which is coming up the supply chain and you don't really know where it's coming from. And that's the just-in-time model. That's what happens. Because if you make demands for fluctuating volumes of goods, but very often, you know, there are peaks and troughs, of course the labour force has got to be very, very flexible and very variable. And so further down the line you'll find people who are very dodgy customers. You know, there'll be people living in caravans being paid under the minimum wage, working in really dodgy conditions, probably got no documentation because that's been taken away, and they're basically working in slavery conditions. I mean, the most interesting recent story was actually about a factory that was bust in Dewsbury last year. The police went in and found, I forget what it was, 4, 5, 6 people working under slavery conditions. Who were they supplying? John Lewis and Next, 5 miles up the road in Leeds. You know, it's not as if you're talking about a clothing factory in Bangladesh. You're actually talking about here and now, literally, here and now. So yeah, look at the big companies, find the ones who've got a presence in Hull, find the ones who've got a threshold of £36 million turnover or more, see whether they've got an anti-slavery statement, and if they haven't, engage in a correspondence with them. You know, excuse me, shouldn't you have an anti-slavery statement? Why not? And if you look at the anti-slavery statement and it looks pretty thin, you can ask some questions about, well, what does this actually mean in practice? What are you doing? How ethical are the conditions under which this stuff's being produced? Well, we know Primark, H&M and Debenhams, which is why I mentioned, were all sourcing stuff from the Rana Plaza factory, which collapsed in Bangladesh 3 years ago. More than 1,000 people were killed in that. You could ask them what they're doing about compensation for the workers' families of the workers who were killed, you know. Or if you want to ask Tesco anything, you could ask them about fish meal, the tuna fish that The Guardian ran a series of articles about last year. Conditions on the boats were absolutely appalling. As the workers complained, they were just thrown overboard, which is rather interesting. I mean, it's appalling, but it's a rather interesting echo of the transatlantic slave trade, because people don't know, but something like 20% of the people who were taken on the boats in Africa to go to America never made it across. Some of them, of course, died of dysentery and cholera and all the rest of it because of the conditions on the boat. Some of them threw themselves overseas, over the side of the boat with chains on because they couldn't bear the thought of going. And some were chucked, literally chucked over. And there was one famous case of an entire boatload of slaves where all the slaves on the boat were thrown overboard. It was, as we would say nowadays, an insurance job. The captain claimed for slaves who'd been lost at sea, but actually they hadn't been lost at sea, they'd been murdered at sea. So you can track that one down on the web too. But sorry, going back to the tuna fish, the kind of leftovers when you package tuna and so on, stuff goes into cat meat. The fish meal goes into cat meat tins. And one of the companies involved in sourcing this stuff was Tesco. And there's an interesting debate because there was an American company whose immediate reaction was, right, we're no longer going to source our tuna from that place. Dodgy business, don't want anything to do with it. Tesco's response was, no, we won't stop because this way we get leverage. If we continue to have the stuff supplied from them, then we've got a bit of leverage over them to improve the conditions for the workers and so on. Well, the question to ask Tesco is, does it work? Does the leverage work? Are you still getting tuna fish for cat meat? And what are you know, what can you show us? Where's the evidence for improved conditions? But you might want to go to Hull City Council, why not? You might want to go to Hull Royal Infirmary, why not? And say, this act's coming along. What's your procurement budget look like? We know the British Medical Association, if you track this down on the web again, there's a small group in the BMA who've been looking at the provision of medical equipment, scalpels, bandages and whatever, and a lot of these are being produced in very, very dodgy conditions. So they're very concerned about it. So, I mean, you know, that would be a question to ask the hospital, the local authority, you know, where do they get their stuff from? Who do they recommend for school uniforms, for example? A lot of people would say go to Primark. Well, we know why they go to Primark, because it's cheap. Why is it cheap? The elements that make up the cost of a school shirt, the material, transportation, and labour costs. If you can keep the labour costs down, i.e. not pay people proper wages, then you can flog stuff much more cheaply.
Do you know with the sort of tightening of UK's borders with Brexit and everything, what sort of effects do you think that's going to have with people not being legally allowed to work here anymore from Eastern Europe? Do you think that's going to have?
Yeah, the research that I did on forced labour over the last 5 or 6 years was interesting because all of the people we found in forced labour, first of all, were here legally. There was no illegal workers amongst them. They were either Eastern European workers who had come under the freedom of movement provisions, got a job perfectly legally, had documentation. The job ended, and by a series of, you know, mistakes and catastrophes or whatever, they ended up in the hands of gang masters who took their documentation away and put them into situations where they were coerced and manipulated and beaten and paid poorly or not at all, living in grotty housing conditions, all the rest of it. So they started off legally, they ended up illegally through no fault of their own. That was one group. The other group were actually British nationals who were here obviously as residents. They might have been recruited at soup kitchens, at homeless shelters, you know, that sort of place. People sometimes with mild learning disabilities, you know, find it difficult to cope, find it difficult to argue, negotiate. Somebody pops up out of nowhere and says, hey, you want a job? Pay you £10 an hour to do tarmacking or you know, harvesting or whatever, and they fall for it, and people have ended up in forced labour situations for 10 or 20 years. Now, if freedom of movement is going to be stopped, and the great British worker doesn't want to get his hands dirty picking potatoes, who's going to do it? You know, I mean, don't get me started on Brexit, because quite clearly most people who voted leave haven't the first idea what they've actually voted for. What they voted for is increased prices and probably you know, diminution of supplies and all the rest of it. Seems to me either the British government's got to do some sort of special deal which will take us back to where we were before, and you may call it freedom of movement or you may call it something else. It'll be described as highly controlled and monitored and supervised and all the rest of it. But we'll end up with schemes like the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Scheme, which has been in place for many, many years and was just abandoned 2 years ago, where students could come from Lithuania or Sweden or Poland or whatever and work here for the season, you know, apple picking or whatever it happened to be, on a special permit. Well, we'll either have that or we'll have a lot more illegal entry, people being smuggled in, people coming on false documentation, whatever, or we'll have some combination of the two. But if you talk to people in the food industry, and this might be an interesting conversation also to have with Tesco or Asda or whatever, you know, what's going to be the impact in terms of supplies? And we're not talking about supplies of Spanish tomatoes, we're talking about supplies of stuff grown in this country. Who's actually going to grow it and harvest it? I think there are going to be some very serious problems, and I think people are only just beginning to wake up to that. Fashion's an interesting one because obviously stuff can actually be fashioned here. You know, the raw materials could be processed and for example, you could have cotton cloth come here and stuff could actually be fashioned. But then you've got individual trade deals to negotiate. You know, what would we negotiate with Bangladesh, for example? You know, a lot of the stuff that's sold in places like Monsoon and Next come from countries which have clothing industries which are staffed largely by very poorly paid women and indeed children, child labour. You think of you know, an elegant dress from Monsoon with all the beading and all the little buttons and so on. This is stuff for little fingers, children's fingers, you know, and there's plenty of evidence around that that sort of stuff is actually done by children in pretty appalling conditions. So I think it's going to be a real mess. There was a piece on the news at lunchtime today. You know, it goes all the way across the piece in terms of the economy. Council of Mortgage Lenders was saying that the number of people defaulting on their mortgages had gone down to a record low, but it's going to go up again simply because the price of everything else is going to go up, and therefore people are not going to be able to keep their mortgages, you know, pay their mortgages and all the rest of it. There's going to be real pressure on housing costs because everything else is going to increase in price. And everything else, of course, is you know, food, fashion, all the rest of it. Yeah. I left some armbands here. I can't remember when it was, but we were giving them out at the Modern Slavery Garden in Chelsea. And bear in mind that the population who go to the Chelsea Flower Show are not your average Hull resident. You know, they're people who would claim, you know, to have thought deeply and long about these kinds of issues. You talk to the average person in the street in Hull or Manchester or Leeds or whatever, they still think slavery is to do with the transatlantic slave trade and that it was abolished by William Wilberforce. They're not really aware that slavery goes on. Well, these people at the Chelsea Flower Show were not really aware that slavery is still going on. And we were giving out, as I say, these wristbands which said, ask the question, is it slavery free? That was our basic simple message. Whatever you buy, whatever you eat, whatever you drink, just ask that question and see what sort of answer you come up with. You know, you can see, I mean, you know where something is bought, you can see where it's made usually from the label, and it's not that difficult to work out some of the answers to these questions and to work out some of the questions you need to be asking of the companies. But should we have a bigger moral conscience? Yeah. I mean, it's great what you're doing because it is part of a campaign. When I first started working in this area 12 years ago, there was hardly any debate about modern slavery at all. It's beginning to gain pace now. I mean, it's unusual to go through a week reading 2 or 3 newspapers and not find some story. Last Tuesday, not the Tuesday just gone, Tuesday last week, there was a programme at 10 o'clock on Channel 4, you probably still get it on iPlayer, the British modern slave trade. Very good programme actually, it's one of the better ones I've seen. But that kind of makes the point that I have seen now 5 or 6 programmes on telly over the last few years and taken part in most of them. Which shows that media awareness is beginning to come. 2 reports last week. One saying that the border force, people who stamp your passport, are appallingly trained to spot the victims of modern slavery. The Anti-Slavery Commissioner worked out that something like 2,500 people had been trafficked into this country through our borders, and there'd only been 1 prosecution as a result. So, you know, they're just completely missing people coming in who are being brought in for the purposes of sex trafficking or labour exploitation. Back in the day when Wilberforce was campaigning, there were huge campaigns. For example, a lot of women persuaded Wedgwood, you know, the pottery factory, to produce a little medallion, pottery medallion, with an image stamped on it of a black slave kneeling in chains. Am I not a man and a brother? Women would wear that and they would campaign to stop people buying West Indian sugar. That was the big campaign then, because most of the slaves were actually working in the sugar plantations in the southern states or in the Caribbean. It'd be fantastic to have a big campaign like that nowadays. You know, we can all do our bit. The website you're talking about, if you can publicise it as widely as possible. The work that I do, you know, I try and reach as many people as possible. That was part of the point of the garden, to reach, you know, 10, 20,000 people we might not otherwise have reached. I'm just hawking roses, modern slavery roses, a new rose, around Humberside at the moment. Jackie's just bought one for the college. That'll be something else, be a bit of press coverage. I was asked in January 2015, December 2015, by a group of horticulturalists who'd had this idea that, I mean, they were committed anti-slavery campaigners, and they thought, well, one way of doing it is to build a modern slavery garden. Very good images on their website, modernslaverygarden.com, which you can lift. You'll see pictures of the team. If you want a picture of me, there's a good picture of me on the website there. My role was to provide technical advice about types of slavery, numbers, where you would find it, and so on and so forth. We didn't know whether it would be accepted by the Chelsea committee. They did accept it. We went there. To our amazement, we got a gold medal for our class, and we also got the prize for what's called the People's Choice, which is a prize sponsored by the BBC and the Royal Horticultural Society. Everyone who goes to Chelsea can just vote for one garden which they thought was most significant, eye-catching, important, whatever. And we won that too last year. So the idea then, which I put forward, was to take the garden on tour. It's not that easy. I mean, I'll say frankly, we are still at the point where it's unsure that it's coming, because we have to raise quite a lot of money. The head of Parks and Gardens here has committed to the site, has committed to providing some of the materials free of charge, but we've got to raise about £50,000, and we've got a fundraiser who's on the year old at the present time, chasing around trying to get the funds. The problem with the City of Culture, I thought there would be an opportunity. It's turned out to be a bit of a bummer because clearly the City of Culture has been on the ear roll trying to raise money from all sorts of places that we might be trying to get money from too. So we're having trouble. I mean, there isn't a great deal of spare money in Hull anyway, but we're having trouble finding people who will stump up the kind of cash. The plan anyway is to have it in the site across the road, in the shadow of the Wilberforce Monument, from July to September. The City of Culture said that that's their freedom quarter. I think the year has been divided into 4 quarters, and July to September is the freedom quarter, when a whole range of activities are going to be going on related to the theme of freedom. So, I mean, they welcomed the idea of having the garden, and we'll be doing a number of things at the Wilberforce Institute to raise the whole question of slavery. And we're hoping, you know, on your blank wall outside, excuse me, somebody will be putting up some slideshows and, you know, some sort of installation as well. I don't know what the fashion people here are planning to do, but, you know, there are all sorts of ways, as I've said, that we can raise the profile of the issue. It's a fine point, really. I mean, it is effectively. I mean, if you think of a definition of slavery which encompasses 3 aspects, one is about coercion, one is about exploitation, and one is about an absence of human rights. Then you could say forced marriage meets the criteria, because I mean, people in a sense know what's going on, but they're forced into it. They are exploited because it's, you know, it's not a marriage that they would choose to have, which is why it's called forced marriage. And, you know, their rights are taken away, their rights of choice. Control over their own body and all the rest of it are taken away. It's not, I mean, if you read most accounts of modern slavery, you don't tend to find forced marriage. You tend to find sex trafficking, labour exploitation, child labour, cannabis farming, forced begging, pickpocketing, even trafficking of human organs. It's beginning to happen in the UK now. But then you get, you know, and then there is forced marriage, and then there's female genital mutilation, and so on and so on.
Is that just linked to religion? Is that why it's not classed in the same thing?
Well, forced marriage?
Yeah.
Not necessarily, because what drives slavery, and always has done, is racism. But racism, racial discrimination, is obviously very closely interrelated to religious difference. So if you go to the countries of the Sahel, places like Mauritania and Mali, you find that Arabs have had black slaves, and the black slaves may have come from another religious tradition, but they've had black slaves, you know, for hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's not a necessary criterion, but, you know, it's something that you find very often happens, because racism is obviously a view of another culture or another ethnic origin as being inferior to your own, and therefore you can, in a sense, you know, you can do what you like with them. I mean, racism fed the transatlantic slave trade. Blacks were regarded as subhuman and should not have any rights. The irony is, of course, that the Christians were driving this philosophy as much as anybody else. And of course, the Church of England has apologised for their role in the transatlantic slave trade, because they were one of the biggest slave holders in 200 years ago. Yeah, religion is closely associated, but it's not necessary to have a religious dimension to it. It just happens very often because that adds to the type of discrimination.